She was 4 months pregnant. She was standing quietly in the lobby of the company her father built. And the woman who ordered security to grab her arm and drag her toward the exit was her mother-in-law. In front of investors, in front of cameras, in front of her husband, who watched and did not move. What nobody in that marble lobby understood, what Margaret Langston would not discover until it was far too late, was that the pregnant woman, being escorted out the door, held 51% of the controlling votes of that entire company. She did not scream. She did not fight back. She counted the security cameras. There were 7. And she already knew exactly what she was going to do next. Stay with this story until the end. Because the moment she finally spoke changed everything. Lesson statement. The most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It is the one who has been quietly keeping records. This story is about what happens when a woman who was underestimated, dismissed, and physically removed from her own company decides that silence was never weakness. It was preparation, meaning, and value statement. What Danielle's story gives you is something most people never see modeled clearly. That dignity does not require volume, that patience is not the same as surrender, and that the most powerful move you can make when someone tries to erase you is to build a record so complete, so precise, so undeniable, that the truth speaks entirely on its own. Whether you are navigating a workplace that underestimates you, a family that dismisses you, or a relationship where your voice keeps being redirected into silence, Danielle's story is a reminder that authority, once legitimately held, cannot be taken. It can only be forgotten, until you decide to remember it. If this story stayed with you, if something in Danielle's patience, or her precision, or the moment she finally walked back into that boardroom felt like something you needed to hear today, then take 1 second and hit the like button, not for the algorithm, for the next woman who needs to find this story and hasn't yet. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, and if you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better. I read every single one. And if you want more stories about quiet strength, real justice, and women who chose documentation over drama, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next story is already waiting.
The morning Danielle Hargrove was escorted out of her own company's gala, she was wearing pearl earrings her late father had given her on her wedding day. She did not scream. She did not cry. She counted the security cameras. There were 7. Danielle had always understood something most people learned too late. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful one. She had grown up watching her father, William Hargrove, build Hargrove Capital from a single commercial property loan in Hartford, Connecticut, into one of the most quietly influential private equity firms on the Eastern Seaboard. He never advertised. He never gave interviews. He preferred fishing on Sunday mornings to charity galas on Saturday nights. Power that needs an audience, he told her once, when she was 12 and sitting beside him at a company dinner in a dress that was too formal and shoes that pinched, is power that is already worried. She had written that down. She wrote most things down. Now at 34, Danielle sat alone in the penthouse kitchen of the building that bore her married name, Langston Tower, 42nd floor, Manhattan, and opened a slim leather notebook whose edges had gone soft from use. Outside, February pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Hudson River moved in slow gray currents below. The city operated with its usual magnificent indifference, taxis threading intersections, men in dark coats speaking into phones, women striding toward offices that would never know their names. She placed one hand flat against the curve of her abdomen. 4 months. Her doctor had used the word stable at the last appointment. Danielle appreciated clinical precision. Stable meant functional. Stable meant contingent. She had written that down too. She wrote the date at the top of the page. February 14th, Valentine's Day. She almost smiled at the irony. Her husband, Carter Langston, emerged from the master bedroom at 7:42, already dressed. Navy tuxedo. Cufflinks that had belonged to his grandfather. Hair combed with the easy confidence of a man who had never once questioned whether he belonged in a room. Carter was genuinely handsome in the way of men who had always been told so. Not arrogantly, but habitually. He was also, in the ways that mattered most, genuinely good-natured. That was what had made Danielle fall in love with him 3 years ago at a sustainability summit in Boston, and what made the present situation so specifically painful. He was not cruel. He was simply unaware. "You are coming tonight, right?" he asked, lifting his phone from the counter without looking at her. "I was planning to. It will be packed. Mom has been running around like she is staging a Broadway opening." He grinned. "Press, investors, the senator from Albany, the whole circus. I am sure she has everything exactly as she wants it," Danielle said evenly. Carter crossed the room and kissed her forehead. Warm, distracted, sincere. "You will be great. Do not let the crowd wear you out." He was gone before she could answer. The penthouse settled back into quiet. Danielle looked down at her notebook. February 14th. Gala. Evening. Carter assumes the attendance. No mention of speaking role. No mention of co-hosting. Third consecutive event framed as his alone. She did not underline anything. She did not need to. Here is something nobody tells you about being systematically excluded from your own life. It rarely happens all at once. It happens in calendar invitations that arrive one day too late. In meeting agendas where your name appears under additional attendees instead of leadership. In the way someone introduces you as Carter's wife instead of your name, and then watches to see whether you will correct them. If you react, you are emotional. If you do not react, you have accepted it. The trap is elegant in its design. Danielle had learned to do neither. She had learned to document. Across Manhattan, in a corner office at Langston Hargrove Holdings headquarters, Margaret Langston reviewed the gala seating chart with the focused intensity of a general reviewing battle plans. Margaret was 63 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the particular elegance that comes not from beauty products, but from decades of absolute certainty that one belongs at the center of every room. She had built the Langston name into a philanthropic institution, museum wings, hospital endowments, a scholarship fund at Dartmouth bearing her late husband's initials. She had also, for the past 14 months, been quietly and methodically reducing Danielle's presence within the company Danielle's own father had founded. Not from cruelty, exactly, from architecture. Danielle should not speak during the foundation segment, she told her assistant Eleanor, without looking up from the seating chart. Should I remove her from the program entirely, or just adjust the agenda, frame it as streamlining? Margaret's pen moved across the chart. Investors respond to clarity. One voice, one vision. Yes, Mrs. Langston. And Eleanor. Margaret glanced up briefly. Make sure the floral arrangement near the podium is white, not cream. White. Eleanor wrote it down. In the margin of the seating chart, barely visible, Margaret had written 2 words in her own hand. Narrative control. Down on the 32nd floor, in the legal department, a woman named Claire Whitmore was having a quietly terrible morning. Claire was Langston Hargrove's general counsel, 39 years old, Yale Law, 11 years at the firm, and possessed of the professional disposition of someone who had learned that the most dangerous problems always arrived disguised as paperwork. She was staring at a vendor authorization form. Harrington Event Group, Strategic Philanthropic Integration Services, $2.8 million. Authorized by M. Langston. Claire pulled the corresponding board minutes. No vote recorded. She checked the authorization threshold matrix. Anything above $2 million required either full board ratification or... And here Claire paused, because she had read the trust documents more carefully than most people in this building ever had. Trustee approval. She opened a new email to Danielle Hargrove Langston. Subject: Compliance question. Vendor authorization. Danielle: I have a procedural question regarding a recent disbursement that I would like to walk through with you at your earliest convenience. No urgency, but I want to make sure we are aligned. Claire. She hit send. Then she sat back and looked at the vendor form again. $2.8 million. No trustee's signature. Huh, she said quietly, to no one. Danielle read Claire's email at 11:15, seated in the back of a car, on the way to her prenatal appointment. She read it twice. Then she opened a secure governance archive on her phone and accessed the structure of Hargrove Capital Trust. Here is what most people inside Langston Hargrove Holdings did not know, and what Margaret Langston had spent 14 months carefully ensuring no one would think to look up. The company had two structures. The public structure was conventional: a board of directors, an executive chair, a CEO, committees, reporting lines, the kind of organizational chart you present to investors at a gala. The private structure was different. When William Hargrove had finalized the merger between Hargrove Capital and Langston Holdings 4 years ago, he had placed 51% of controlling voting shares into an irrevocable trust, Hargrove Capital Trust, with a governance clause he had written himself, in language that was precise to the point of poetry. Trustee authority, including override capability in cases of fiduciary breach or beneficiary harm, is assigned permanently to Danielle Ann Hargrove. Danielle had become trustee 6 months before her wedding, when her father died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in October, still wearing his fishing hat. She had not corrected anyone's assumptions since. Her father's voice: power that needs an audience is power that is already worried. At the prenatal clinic, the ultrasound technician turned the screen slightly. "There is your baby," she said warmly. A flutter, a heartbeat. Danielle watched the monitor without speaking. She memorized the rhythm. Outside in the waiting room, her phone buzzed. Carter. "Big night tonight. Proud of everything we have built." Danielle typed back slowly. "Be careful with that word, we." He responded with a laughing emoji. He thought she was teasing. She was not teasing. Before we continue, here is something worth remembering. When someone systematically excludes you from rooms you belong in, the instinct is to fight loudly for your seat. But the more powerful move is to document the exclusion itself. Every omission, every redirected invitation, every casual erasure becomes evidence. Patience, in the right circumstances, is not weakness, it is architecture. By 7:30, Langston Hargrove Holdings headquarters had transformed. The lobby, 3 stories of Italian marble, crowned by a chandelier, commissioned in 1987, and engraved with the company's founding date, glittered with the particular intensity of an event designed to make money feel like virtue. String quartet near the east staircase, press photographers along the right corridor, donors in evening wear exchanging curated pleasantries about climate initiatives and hospital wings. Margaret moved through it all with the ease of someone who had been rehearsing this specific performance for 40 years. She wore a deep burgundy gown. She had personally approved every floral arrangement. White, not cream. She had also positioned Tom Braddock, head of security, 22 years with the company, former NYPD, near the central column with specific instructions. If Mrs. Langston becomes disruptive, handle it quietly. Tom had nodded. He had heard disruptive before. He assumed it meant drunk or hostile or causing a scene. He had not anticipated pregnant and walking calmly. Danielle arrived at 7:42. Her pale blue gown was deliberately understated. She walked slowly, not from hesitation, but from the pregnancy's quiet renegotiation of her center of gravity. She noticed the security positioning immediately. She noticed Margaret across the room, smile calibrated to the millimeter. She noticed her name did not appear on the event program at the welcome table. She picked up a program, scanned it, set it down. Mrs. Langston. Margaret appeared at her elbow with practiced grace. You look lovely. Though I thought you might rest this evening, I feel well, thank you. Events like this can be taxing, particularly in your condition. My condition is a pregnancy, Margaret, not an illness. A flicker behind Margaret's eyes, not quite anger, not quite surprise, something recalibrating. Of course, she said pleasantly. Enjoy the evening. She moved away. Danielle placed one hand against her abdomen briefly. Steady. Carter found her, near the bar, 20 minutes later, glowing with the particular energy of a man who had just closed a successful investor conversation. You made it. He kissed her cheek. You look beautiful. Thank you. Mom has everything running perfectly. The senator just arrived. He grinned. Did you see the flowers? She ordered them from Belgium. Belgium, Danielle repeated. For a February gala in New York, right? Very her. He squeezed her hand, already turning. I am on in 40 minutes. Will you be near the front? I will find a place, she said. He moved toward a group of board members, waving him over. Danielle watched him go. She found Claire Whitmore, near the back of the hall, standing slightly apart, expression doing quiet arithmetic. Their eyes met. Claire's held a question. Danielle's held an answer. Not yet. The moment arrived 40 minutes later. Danielle had positioned herself near the east wall during Carter's speech. Close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd the frame, she stood beside a marble pillar, one hand resting lightly against it for balance. She felt the approach before she saw it. Tom Braddock materialized at her left shoulder. A second security officer appeared at her right. Ms. Langston, Tom said, voice low. Ms. Langston, Margaret has asked that you step outside for a moment. I am fine, Tom. She indicated you might be unwell. I am not unwell. Danielle's voice remained even. I am standing at a company event I have every right to attend. Tom hesitated. He was a decent man, caught between a directive and a visible reality that did not match it. Then Margaret's voice cut cleanly across the ambient noise. Tom, now, please. The word now was quiet. It was also absolute. Tom's hand closed around Danielle's arm, not cruelly, but firmly. The second guard mirrored the movement on her right. Please, Danielle said quietly, her free hand moving instinctively toward her abdomen. I am pregnant. Do not. Her heel caught the edge of the marble flooring as they turned her. The shift in balance was sudden. Her free hand flew to her stomach. The string quartet faltered on a note. A champagne flute shattered somewhere to the left. Carter turned from the podium. His face registered confusion, then shock, then something that had not yet fully assembled itself into what it would eventually become. But he did not move. Not toward her, not yet. Margaret stepped smoothly to his side, one hand on his arm. She is overwhelmed, she murmured. It is better this way. And Carter, good-natured, unaware Carter, let himself be steadied. Outside, the February air hit Danielle's face immediately. Tom released her arm once they reached the stone steps. The second guard stepped back. "I am sorry, ma'am," Tom said quietly. He meant it. Danielle gripped the iron railing and found her balance. She looked up at the security camera, mounted above the entrance, Busmom, Distinction, a small, blinking red eye. She looked directly into it. "It is noted," she said. She descended the steps alone. Inside, through the heavy glass doors, she could see Margaret return to the microphone. "Apologies for the brief interruption," Margaret said lightly, warmth sewn through every syllable. "Family always comes first," which is precisely what tonight celebrates. Laughter. Warm, compliant, relieved. Danielle did not look back. She was already on her phone. "Claire, please preserve all entrance camera footage from 7:48 p.m. tonight. Discreetly. Chain of custody matters." Claire's response arrived in 40 seconds. Already on it. Danielle did not go home. She made it halfway across the bridge before the cramping started. Low and insistent, not quite pain, but something adjacent to it. Something her body was saying in a language that did not wait for interpretation. "Turn around," she told the driver. "Mount Sinai." The driver looked at her once in the rearview mirror. He turned around without a word. In the emergency obstetrics unit, everything moved with calibrated efficiency. Monitors, blood pressure readings. A nurse with a voice trained to soothe without patronizing. "Any abdominal impact tonight?" Danielle paused. Forceful contact. I remained upright. The nurse wrote something. Her expression did not change, but her pen moved more deliberately. "How many weeks?" 17. The attending physician arrived 20 minutes later. Dr. Rachel Connors reviewed the readings with focused quiet. "Stress-induced uterine tightening," she said finally. "Baby's heartbeat is strong and stable. No immediate harm detected." Danielle exhaled. "However," Dr. Connors added, and the word landed with clinical weight, "you are in your second trimester. Stress events of this kind accumulate. Physical confrontation or sustained high-tension environments carry real risk at this stage." "Understood." Dr. Connors looked at her for a moment. "The bruising on your left forearm is documented," Danielle said quietly. A pause. "I will note it in the chart," the doctor said, "with full clinical description. Thank you." Alone in the dim recovery room, the fetal monitor keeping its steady rhythm, Danielle looked at the ceiling for a long time. She had not cried yet. She would not cry here. She waited until she was completely certain of the room's privacy. Door closed. Monitor steady. No footsteps in the hallway. Then she let 3 tears fall. Precisely. Like someone releasing pressure from a controlled system. Then she picked up her phone. "Claire, initiate litigation hold. All documents, communications, and financial records touching Langston Foundation disbursements for the past 18 months. Full preservation. Danielle, that will alert people," Claire wrote back. "Yes," Danielle replied. "It will?" Carter called at 11:47. "Where are you? Hospital? The baby is stable." Silence. "What happened?" "I am fine. She is fine." "She?" His voice broke slightly on the word. He had not known the gender yet. She had been waiting to tell him differently, not like this. The doctor confirmed tonight. "A girl." Another silence. Longer. "Danielle, I know." Her voice was steady. "But Carter, they grabbed me. In front of everyone. In front of cameras. Mom said you were overwhelmed. Carter." She kept her voice level. "I was standing at a marble pillar holding a glass of sparkling water. I have bruises on my arm and our daughter's heartbeat accelerated from the stress. That is not overwhelmed. That is a directive. The silence this time was different. She could hear him processing it. The slow, uncomfortable sound of a man whose certainty is cracking. I will come right now. Stay. Finish your obligations, she paused. We will talk tomorrow. There are things about the company's structure you need to understand. What things? She looked at the fetal monitor, the steady green line. Things I should have told you before we were married. I thought they did not matter. I was wrong. She ended the call. The monitor kept its rhythm. Steady. Alive. Uncomplicated. Here is something nobody talks about enough. Documentation is not paranoia. It is protection. If you are in a situation where someone in power is systematically undermining you, at work, in a family, in a marriage, the single most important thing you can do is create a record. Dates, times, exact words, witnesses, not to be vindictive, to be protected, because the moment you need to defend yourself, the only thing that will matter is what you can prove. The following morning, Danielle was discharged with a printed medical summary and instructions to avoid sustained stress. She rode home in a car that felt quieter than usual. Carter was waiting in the penthouse kitchen, still in last night's dress shirt, coffee untouched, wearing the particular haggard look of a man who has spent several hours being forced to reconsider things he had previously been comfortable not examining. He stood when she came in. She sat at the kitchen table. For a moment, neither spoke. "Show me," Carter said finally. She extended her left forearm. The bruising was visible. Not cinematic, not dramatic, just real, a pressure mark along the inside of her arm where Tom Braddock's hand had been. Carter sat down. He looked at it for a long time. "She told Tom to remove you," he said quietly. "I thought remove meant escort you somewhere private, not—" The word she used to Tom was now, Danielle said. "The security radio audio has been preserved." Carter looked up. "How do you know what word she—" "Security radio channel. Archived before standard overwrite intervals." A pause. "Danielle, how long have you been doing this?" She met his eyes steadily. "Since February of last year, when I was removed from the investor prep call without notice. March. When the board agenda was revised, and my name was removed without explanation. April. When finance sent me revisions after the approval window had already closed." Carter stared at her. "You have a record of all of it?" "I have a notebook." She placed it on the table between them. "And a governance archive. And now I have a litigation hold on 14 months of financial records." The word litigation landed in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. "Why did you not tell me any of this?" She looked at him carefully. "Because I wanted to know whether it was oversight or intent. And," she looked at the notebook, "it is intent." Carter's conversation with Margaret happened that afternoon in her corner office. He had walked in with righteous clarity. The bruise on his wife's arm, the hospital visit, the preserved audio. He intended to be firm. Margaret had listened to all of it without a single change in expression. Then she said, very gently, "Carter, she has been quietly building a case against this family for months. The litigation hold, the financial inquiries, that is not a wife protecting herself. That is someone constructing a claim." Carter frowned. "She is not constructing anything. Her father's trust structure gives her authority that supersedes mine. And yours." Margaret folded her hands. "Did you know that? What authority?" "Controlling voting shares. 51%. Trustee override capability." Margaret's voice remained perfectly level. "Your wife has been technically able to remove me from this company since the day her father died. And she has been waiting, documenting, building toward a moment." Carter was quiet. "Think about it," Margaret said softly. "The notebook, the archived emails, the litigation hold initiated from a hospital bed the same night she was escorted out. Not after she rested, but from a hospital bed at midnight. Does that sound like a woman who is overwhelmed? Or a woman executing a plan? Carter left without making a promise. He went to the building's gym and hit a punching bag for 45 minutes, trying to decide which version of his wife was real. Margaret watched him go from her window. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she had not dialed in 18 months. "Robert," she said when the call connected, "I need to discuss the trust restructuring. Urgently." Robert Ashby, Margaret's personal attorney, a man who had been navigating the edges of legal gray areas for 30 years, listened carefully. "What specifically are you concerned about?" he asked. "The Hargrove Trust structure. Trustee authority clause. I need to know if there is a challenge mechanism." A pause. "Margaret, is the trustee currently active?" "She will be soon. I will need to review the original language." "But Margaret, if she has already initiated a litigation hold, any attempt to restructure the trust at this stage would appear." "I am not asking how it appears," Margaret said quietly. "I am asking if it is possible." Robert Ashby was silent for a moment. "Send me the documents." Margaret ended the call. She did not feel panic. She felt like someone who had just realized the game they had been winning had different rules than they thought, and who had decided, with absolute calm, to change the rules again. 3 days after the gala, Claire Whitmore sat across from a forensic accountant named James Calloway in a sealed conference room on the 32nd floor. James was mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, with the energy of a man who found financial irregularities genuinely, personally interesting in the way other people found crossword puzzles interesting. "Let me show you something," he said, turning his laptop toward Claire. The screen showed a financial map. Lines connecting entities like a web drawn by someone who believed they were being careful. "Langston Foundation Initiative," James said, pointing to the first node, to Harrington Event Group, to a Delaware shell entity, to Langston Strategic Ventures. "Harrington Event Group," Claire said slowly. "That is the vendor with the 2.8 million authorization." "Correct. And Harrington Event Group has a registered address that traces back to an attorney, Robert Ashby, who has previously represented Margaret Langston's personal investment portfolio." Claire looked at the screen. "Conflict of interest. At minimum." James clicked deeper. "But it gets more interesting. Langston Strategic Ventures holds a 12% stake in a renewable energy startup called ClearPath Energy. And Margaret Langston publicly endorsed ClearPath Energy at last quarter's investor call, without disclosing her indirect financial interest." Silence. "Self-dealing," Claire said. "The money came from charitable foundation accounts, routed through an affiliated vendor, ended up in an investment vehicle that personally benefits the executive who authorized the original disbursement." James closed his laptop. "It is elegant, actually, in a deeply problematic way." "How much total?" 8.6 million over 14 months. Claire exhaled slowly. "Prepare a full report. Board ready within 48 hours." Danielle received the preliminary findings on a Thursday morning. She read them at her desk, both hands flat on the surface, the way she always held herself when something required absolute stillness. $8.6 million. 14 months, her father's company's charitable funds routed into her mother-in-law's personal investment vehicle. She thought of her father's voice. Never accuse. Prove. She had proved. She opened her laptop and began drafting the notice of a special board meeting. That evening, Carter came home early. He stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her work at the dining table, and for a moment he looked like the man she had married, open, trying, present. "I talked to Mom," he said. "I know." He sat across from her. She said things about your motives, about the notebook. She implied the litigation hold is not protection, it is strategy. Danielle looked at him steadily. Carter, your mother routed $8.6 million from our charitable foundation through a shell entity into a private investment vehicle that personally benefits her. She then publicly endorsed that investment without disclosing her financial interest. She did all of it without board approval or trustee ratification, which is legally required. Carter stared at her. That is documented. He ran a hand across his jaw. Show me. She turned her laptop toward him. He read for a long time. When he looked up, something had shifted in his face. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just real. The specific expression of a man discovering that the floor he has been standing on is not the floor he thought it was. I did not know, he said, quietly. I know you did not. She used the foundation money. Yes, to personally invest in... Yes, he sat back. He was quiet for a moment. What happens now? I convene the board. I invoke trustee authority, and we correct the structure. And my mother? Danielle met his eyes. That depends on what the board decides. Carter was quiet for a long time, then very quietly. I will vote for correction. It was not the declaration of a hero. It was the quiet statement of a man who had finally decided to pay attention. Danielle nodded once. Thank you. The board notice went out at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. Special board session. Grounds, Trustee Governance Review under Hargrove, Capital Trust, Section 7.3. 9 board members received it. Margaret received it. Carter received it while standing at the elevator. He read it twice. Then he called Danielle. She did not answer. For 48 hours after sending the notice, Danielle allowed herself to believe the worst was over. Documentation was airtight. Carter was aligned. Claire had preserved everything. She should have checked the secondary accounts first. She should have known that Margaret Langston did not lose without a countermove. Catastrophic Event 1. The Trust Challenge. On the morning the board notice was distributed, Margaret made 3 calls. The first was to Robert Ashby. File the challenge. Margaret, I need to advise. File it. The second was to Samuel Aldridge. Senior board member, 20-year relationship, 2 generations of Langston Foundation donations to his family's hospital wing. Samuel, I need your vote. The third was to a financial journalist who owed Margaret a favor for a source introduction she had facilitated 2 years earlier. I have a story for you, she said, about a trust dispute inside Langston Hargrove Holdings, about a young woman using a pregnancy and a compliance claim to seize control of a company she did not build. The article ran the following morning. Catastrophic Event 2. The public narrative. Danielle read the article at 6:47 a.m. The headline, Langston Hargrove Holdings, is a compliance drama masking a hostile takeover. The article did not use her name. It did not need to. It described a trustee, the CEO's wife, recently pregnant, who had initiated an aggressive governance review that sources inside the company describe as weaponizing compliance processes for personal gain. 3 anonymous quotes. 2 of them used the word emotional. One called it a pregnancy power play. Danielle set her phone down on the kitchen counter. She stood at the window for exactly 2 minutes, then she picked the phone back up. Claire, have you seen it? Claire's response. Just now. It is Ashby's work. He filed a formal challenge to the trust structure this morning. Filed at 6 a.m. Danielle closed her eyes. And Samuel Aldridge? A pause. He called me 20 minutes ago. He is reconsidering his vote. She opened her eyes. Below, the city moved with its usual indifferent urgency. She placed her hand against her abdomen. The baby was still. Okay, she said quietly, to herself, to the city, to the version of her father she carried everywhere. Okay, catastrophic event 3. The doctor's call. Robert Ashby's legal filing arrived formally at Claire's office at 9 a.m. It was 63 pages long. The argument was sophisticated. The Hargrove Capital Trust had been established under governance language that had been superseded, Ashby argued, by a revised merger restructuring agreement, a document that contained a clause buried in Appendix D that appeared to transfer trustee operational authority to the executive chair in cases of extraordinary business circumstances. Claire read it twice. Then she called Danielle. She had the merger documents revised, Claire said, 18 months ago. Appendix D, the language is specifically designed to neutralize the trustee override. A silence. Was the revision disclosed to the board? Danielle asked. No. Was it disclosed to my father's estate attorneys? No. Then it is not valid, Danielle said. Pull the original execution records. The amendment requires co-signature from the trustee of record. I never signed it. Danielle, if you never signed it, then it does not exist. Find me the execution log. She had just ended the call with Claire when her phone rang again. Dr. Patricia Connors, her OB. I have reviewed your charts from the Mount Sinai admission, Dr. Connors said carefully, combined with your previous readings. Danielle, I need you to come in today, not tomorrow, today. Danielle went still. What are you seeing? Your blood pressure has been elevated in a pattern that concerns me, combined with the stress episode at the gala. I need to discuss potential early onset preeclampsia. It is not certain yet, but I want to be proactive. Danielle set down her pen. Preeclampsia, a condition that, in worst-case scenarios, threatened both mother and child. She looked at the financial maps spread across her desk. She looked at Claire across the table. Then she felt the baby move. A small, clear, insistent flutter. Not distressed, just present. I am here, it seemed to say. Do not stop. Danielle placed her hand against her side. I will not, she said quietly. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and turned to Claire. Before I go, pull the original Hargrove Trust execution records, all signature pages, and get me the metadata log on the Appendix D amendment. I want to know the exact date it was created, the workstation it was created on, and whether Robert Ashby's firm IP address appears in the creation log. Claire blinked. That would prove it was drafted externally. Without my knowledge and without valid co-signature, Danielle picked up her bag. That is not a superseded trust. That is a forgery. She walked out. Claire sat for a moment. Then she started typing very fast. The preeclampsia risk was real but manageable, Dr. Connors told her, with reduced stress, monitored blood pressure, and avoidance of high conflict environments. Danielle listened carefully. She thanked Dr. Connors, scheduled a follow-up, and sat in her car in the parking garage for 6 minutes. She thought about her father. William Hargrove had died on a Tuesday in October, still wearing his fishing hat, leaving behind a company, a trust, a daughter, and a note written in the margins of the trust document in faint blue ink. Power is safest when quiet, but when it must speak, speak completely. She started the car. The metadata on Appendix D came back that evening at 7:30. James Calloway called directly. The document was created 14 months ago, he said, 1 month after the gala where the exclusions began. Robert Ashby's firm? His IP address is in the creation log. The document was created at Ashby and Partners, not at Langston Hargrove Holdings. And the co-signature page? Blank. No trustee signature, no date, no notarization. Danielle was quiet. James? Is that sufficient to establish fraudulent amendment, combined with the financial routing and the undisclosed self-dealing? A pause. Danielle, this is no longer just a corporate governance matter. This is potentially criminal. She closed her eyes. Prepare the full file. I want it ready for the board meeting. And for the Securities and Exchange Commission, if necessary. Understood. She ended the call. She sat in the quiet of her home office. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been right for a very long time and is only now being believed. At 9 p.m., she received a text from an unknown number. You should know that Carter met with my client this afternoon. He is not planning to vote with you. No signature, no name. She set the phone down. She sat with it. She picked up her father's trust document and turned to the margin note. Power is safest when quiet, but when it must speak, speak completely. She opened her laptop. She began to draft the board notice. She did not need Carter's vote. She was the trustee. She had always been the trustee. Here is something that nobody talks about enough. There will be a moment in any significant fight where the person you most counted on does not show up, where the one who should stand beside you chooses comfort instead. That moment will feel like the end. It is not. It is clarifying, because it tells you something important. You were never actually dependent on that support. You only believed you were. The authority was always yours. The question was only whether you would use it. The notice went out at 9 a.m. on Wednesday. Special board session, grounds, trustee governance review, under Hargrove Capital Trust Section 7.3. Margaret received it. Carter received it while standing at the elevator. He read it twice. Then he called Danielle. She did not answer. The board convened at 10 a.m. in conference room A. Glass walls, river view, a long table with 11 chairs occupied. Danielle entered last. Charcoal suit, flat shoes, the pearl earrings her father had given her. She placed a leather folder on the table and sat at the far end. Margaret sat at the opposite end, composed as always, burgundy blazer, silver hair immaculate. Between them, Carter, Claire, James Calloway, Samuel Aldridge, and 5 other board members, ranging from cautiously curious to visibly uncomfortable. This session has been convened, Claire began, under trustee authority, pursuant to Section 7.3 of Hargrove Capital Trust Governance Structure. Before we proceed, Margaret said smoothly, I would like to note that the trust structure itself is currently under legal challenge, and the validity of this session is therefore, the challenge is invalid, Claire said. That determination has not yet been. The Appendix D amendment was created at Robert Ashby's firm 14 months ago. The co-signature page is blank. The trustee of record never signed it. Claire slid a printed report toward each board member. Document creation, metadata, IP log, and signature comparison are exhibits A through C. Margaret looked at the reports. For the first time, something moved behind her composure. Not panic, but the specific expression of someone who has discovered that a card they believed was hidden is sitting face up on the table. James Calloway presented the financial findings. $8.6 million. Harrington Event Group, Delaware Shell Entity, Langston Strategic Ventures, the Clear Path Energy public endorsement without disclosure. He walked through it in 22 minutes without raising his voice once. Samuel Aldridge, who had been leaning back with practiced neutrality, leaned forward at the Clear Path slide. She endorsed that investment publicly at the Q3 investor call. The recording is Exhibit F, while holding an indirect financial interest. Correct. Aldridge looked at Margaret. I believed, Margaret said carefully, that the investment aligned with our strategic direction. Any benefit to me was secondary and incidental. 8.6 million from charitable funds is incidental, Aldridge said. The disbursements were authorized under emergency branding provisions, Claire said, for amounts exceeding unilateral authorization thresholds, without board vote, without trustee ratification, 3 separate times. Silence. Danielle had not yet spoken. She had let the documentation speak. Now Margaret turned toward her directly. "You planned this," she said, not loudly, almost admiringly. From the beginning, Danielle met her gaze. "I documented it," she said. "There is a difference. You used a pregnancy. I used a trust structure my father built to protect this company from exactly this scenario." Danielle's voice remained even. "The pregnancy is not a strategy, Margaret. It is a human being. And your actions, including the physical removal at the gala and the forged amendment, placed both of us at documented medical risk." She slid the Mount Sinai medical summary across the table. The bruise documentation, the preeclampsia alert. The room went very quiet. Carter was staring at the medical report. He was not looking at his mother. Then the final piece. Danielle slid forward a printed email chain recovered from archived executive correspondence. Subject line, narrative management. Margaret's email, addressed to Tom Braddock, dated 2 days before the gala. "Ensure Danielle's presence is minimized. We cannot risk conflicting optics. If necessary, remove her discreetly." The room stilled. Carter's breath was audible. Margaret's composure fractured, not visibly, but structurally. Her posture tightened, her chin lifted. "That was a preventative measure," she said. "It demonstrates intent," Claire said. "The directive aligns with the recorded security audio." Samuel Aldridge leaned back slowly. "Intent plus financial non-disclosure, plus forged amendment," he murmured. As if reading a list, Carter stared at the email. He spoke almost to himself. "You plan to remove her." Margaret's voice sharpened. "I plan to protect stability." Danielle's voice remained soft. "By eliminating oversight." The word hung in the air. Oversight. Carter closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the inherited confidence he had worn his entire life was gone. In its place was something quieter, something earned. "Please read Clause 7.3 in full," Danielle said to Claire. Claire read, "In the event of demonstrable executive misconduct impacting corporate integrity or beneficiary welfare, trustee retains unilateral authority to initiate corrective action, including temporary removal from executive function, pending independent review." Margaret's jaw tightened. "You would use your pregnancy as leverage." "I am using documentation," Danielle said. Michael looked at his mother. "You endangered her." Victoria's eyes flashed. "I preserved legacy." Carter's reply was quiet but final. "At what cost?" The board voted. Hands lifted one by one. Aldridge. 3 others. 2 more. Carter's hand rose last. He did not look at his mother when he raised it. Final count. 8 in favor. 1 abstention. 0 opposed. "Motion carries," Claire said. "Suspension of Margaret Langston's executive authority, effective immediately." Margaret stood slowly. She looked at Danielle across the length of the table. "You will fracture more than you think," she said quietly. Danielle met her eyes without hostility. "Correction is not fracture," she said. "It is structure." Margaret turned to Carter. "You chose her." Carter's voice did not waver. "I chose accountability." Margaret exited without another word. The door closed behind her with a controlled finality. Nobody spoke. Then Samuel Aldridge cleared his throat. "Well," he said, with the dry, exhausted humor of a man who had witnessed too many governance crises, "remind me never to skip the appendices again." Nervous laughter moved around the table like a small wave. Even Danielle almost smiled. Almost. In the 48 hours that followed the board meeting, Langston Hargrove Holdings shifted the way atmospheric pressure changes before weather. Not suddenly, gradually, unmistakably. Access permissions were updated. Signatory authority redistributed. Finance staff received dual verification protocols. The hostile article was followed, 3 days later, by a measured piece in the Financial Times. Langston Hargrove Holdings initiates governance review. Analysts call it a model of voluntary compliance. Carter brought her coffee in the morning. He sat across the kitchen table. "Is it over?" he asked. "The worst of it," she said. She believed it when she said it. She should have checked the secondary accounts first. James Calloway called on a Friday afternoon. His voice had the specific, careful quality of someone delivering information they wish they did not have. "I found another account," he said. Danielle set down her pen. "Tell me." Langston Strategic Ventures made a secondary transfer to a personal account, a joint LLC called Hargrove Langston Family Office. She waited. Danielle. A pause. Carter's name is on the formation documents. The silence lasted 5 full seconds. "When was it formed?" she asked. 11 months ago, after the first disbursement." "Yes." She looked at the Hudson River. "Does he know?" she asked quietly. "I cannot determine intent from financial records alone," James said carefully, "but his signature is on the formation documents. Notarized." She closed her eyes. "Send me the documents, Danielle." "Thank you, James." She ended the call. She sat for a long time. She showed Carter the documents that evening. She placed them on the kitchen table between them. The same kitchen table where he had said, "I will vote for correction," where she had allowed herself, just briefly, to believe they were building something honest together. He looked at the LLC formation documents. His face did something complicated. "I did not know what it was," he said. "Your signature is notarized. My mother told me it was a family financial planning vehicle, a tax structure. I signed without—" He stopped, ran both hands over his face. "I signed without reading it." Danielle looked at him carefully. "Carter, I know," he said. "I know. Your signature on these documents connects you to the secondary transfer. If the SEC expands its inquiry—" "I know." His voice broke on the word. "Danielle, I swear to you, I did not understand what I was signing." She studied him. She had always been good at reading rooms. She was also not objective about this particular person. She had never been. "I believe you," she said finally. He exhaled. "But believing you and protecting you are two different things. The SEC will determine intent. What you need to do, what you must do, is get ahead of this. Your own attorney, separate from the company's counsel. Tonight, full voluntary disclosure. Everything." He looked at her. "You are still helping me." "I am advising you," she said, "the way I would advise anyone who had made a serious mistake without malicious intent." A pause. "Is there a difference?" She met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "there is." The SEC inquiry ran for 30 days. It concluded with a sealed preliminary finding: failure to disclose beneficial financial interest, breach of fiduciary transparency obligations, insufficient internal oversight prior to trustee intervention, mitigating factor, voluntary disclosure, and immediate corrective action, civil penalty assessed, governance reforms mandated, no criminal referral at this stage. Carter cooperated fully. His voluntary disclosure, his own attorney's proactive engagement, and Danielle's documented evidence that his signature had been obtained without material explanation of the LLC's purpose. These factors combined to narrow his personal exposure significantly. Margaret's finding was separate. The civil penalty was substantial. Her advisory role, the last formal title she held, was suspended pending resolution. She attended the final board session remotely. When invited to respond to the findings, she said only, "I built this company with my hands. What I am charged with is not what I intended." Samuel Aldridge said quietly, "Intention is not the standard. Disclosure is." Margaret's screen went dark. Danielle addressed the company in the lobby. The same marble lobby, the same chandelier, the same polished floors that had carried the sound of her heels being dragged across them 6 weeks earlier. Now cameras faced her. Board members stood behind her. Carter stood among the employees. Not beside her, among them. Equal footing. She had asked him to stand there. He had understood why. Institutions survive, she said, because structure survives, not because individuals remain. What we corrected here is not a story about one person's misconduct. It is a reminder that governance exists for a reason, and that when it fails, someone has to be willing to enforce it, even at personal cost. She paused. That cost was real, for everyone in this building. I do not minimize it. She stepped back from the podium. The applause was not exuberant. It was steady, the sound of people who had been through something difficult and were still standing. 3 months after the gala, Danielle moved her primary office to the 28th floor, smaller, quieter, a view of the river instead of the skyline. She remained trustee. She reduced her visible executive role, not because she had been diminished, but because she had decided that visibility and authority were not the same thing, and she preferred to spend her energy on the latter. Carter began individual therapy. He had mentioned it to her carefully, the way someone mentions something they have already decided, but want to be honest about. "I need to understand why I kept choosing comfort," he said, "over truth, over you." She had looked at him for a long moment. "That is the right question," she said. They were not reconciled. They were not finished. They were, for the first time in their marriage, honest. Margaret Langston sent Danielle a single handwritten note 6 weeks after the final resolution, cream stationery, her monogram at the top. "You are more like your father than I gave you credit for. That is not an apology, but it is acknowledgement." M.L. Danielle read it once. She placed it inside the leather folder with the trust documents. Then she wrote one line in her notebook below it, "Acknowledged." On a Tuesday morning in April, Danielle gave birth to a daughter. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, perfect fingers, a specific, insistent cry that the nurses said meant she knew exactly what she wanted. Carter was in the room. He stood near the window at a careful distance, and then the nurse placed the baby in Danielle's arms, and something in his face rearranged itself into something new, something that was not performance and not inheritance, and not the easy confidence of a man who had always been affirmed. Just love. Simple. Unearned. Real. "She looks like your father," he said quietly. Danielle looked down at her daughter. "Good," she said. Later, when the room was quiet, and Carter had stepped out and the monitors kept their steady rhythm, Danielle opened her notebook for the last time. She had been keeping it for 14 months. She turned to the first entry. February 14th. Gala evening. Carter assumes attendance. She turned to the last page. She wrote, April 8th. Baby girl. Healthy. Structure holds. She closed the notebook. She placed it in the drawer of the hospital bedside table. She would not need it anymore. Not because the fight was over, but because the fight had become something else entirely. It had become a foundation. Here is what Danielle's story teaches, and what is worth carrying with you long after this video ends. The most powerful thing you can do when facing injustice is not to fight loudly. It is to build a record that cannot be argued with. Document. Preserve. Act within the rules, but act completely. The authority you have been given. in your work, in your family, in your own life, is not ceremonial. It is real. Use it when it matters. Use it especially when using it costs you something. Because dignity, once chosen, does not require an audience to be genuine. And remember this: the people who underestimate your silence are always surprised by your voice. Outside, spring moved through Manhattan the way it always does. Tentatively at first, then with sudden, irreversible conviction. In the lobby of Langston Hargrove Holdings, the chandelier still hung above marble floors, polished to a mirror shine. The founding date was still engraved in the brass. 2 names, Hargrove, Langston. What had changed was not the names. What had changed was the understanding of what they meant. Not legacy, not narrative, not the kind of power that needs an audience. Structure. And Danielle Hargrove, trustee, mother, the quietest person in almost every room she had ever entered, understood, more clearly than ever, the difference between the two. She always had. If you stayed until the end of this story, you already know something about quiet strength. You know what it costs, and you know what it is worth. Tell me where you are watching from. And what in Danielle's story stayed with you the longest? The patience, the moment she finally spoke completely, the look on Carter's face when he raised his hand. I read every comment. And if you believe that dignity is more powerful than noise, you are exactly who this channel is for. Closing disclaimer: this content was carefully researched, constructed, and manually edited by our team. Written with intention, shaped with purpose, and built to carry meaning beyond entertainment. Every story we tell is designed to leave you with something real. A perspective, a lesson, or simply the reminder that you are not alone in what you have faced. We do not produce content to fill time. We produce it to matter.